I'm going to talk a little bit about the land and things that went on there, and Laura's going to talk about what went from the land into the lake and what the consequences of that war. And how many of you want to forget 2019? Right on, right? For me, I want to think about 2019 for a little bit longer and maybe a lot longer, because reality is I wonder how many lessons that we can learn from 2019 that relate to the lake, and that's what I want to try and understand better. When we talk about Lake Erie, we talk about a couple of years that really told us what impact phosphorus can have in Lake Erie in relationship to harmful algal blooms. 2011 and 2012. What happened in 2011? Was it very similar to 2019? From an agricultural perspective, not quite as bad because we actually got planted, but we did have a very wet year and we had a large algal bloom. 2012, what was the algal bloom like in 2012? Very minimal. And what was the agricultural production like? Drought. 2015 and 16, we had a similar scenario. So, from a lake perspective, the idea of inflows of phosphorus really became a resounding understanding of what the impact was in relationship to phosphorus movement off the land into the lake, and how that then resulted in a harmful algal bloom difference. Then 2019 comes along, and what happened in 2019 is we had a lot of things that happened in relationship to what went on in the land. Preventive planting, no fertilizer applications, just no tillage would have been going on. Just a variety of things then that led into where we had no crops at all planted on acres in a lot of areas. And those all show up, I think, in something that we need to try and pull out and parse out and understand better what 2019 had on impact. And so we're looking at it from a nutrient application standpoint, what happened in nutrient application. For me, I want to see how, and when I say want to see how, I want to try and get some of my research friends to help me understand better how 2019 and some of these trends relate back to other years. And I'll talk about a few key years that I think we ought to be thinking about comparison to try and parse out relationships. And the relationships that I want to start to know is what is agriculture's impact, what are things that we can control, what are the best management practices that we can put in place to control that agricultural contribution, but then also maybe there are other things that we are missing in what we're talking about and discussing that need to be focused on as well. And so just get a better understanding of that whole system and where agriculture falls in it. And I put this line at the bottom. These are the numbers that have been running through my mind for the past really 6-8 months. 10, 2.7, and 4.3. What is 10? 10 is a year where we've had a harmful algal bloom that is at the top of the scale. That's 2011, 2015. That is where we've had those maximum types of coverage. 2.7, I think Laura is going to talk about with us a little bit later, that maybe we should have in 2019 seen a 10 on that scale, and we ended up being 2.7% or 2.7 less on that scale. We ended up with a 7.3 bloom. This past year is what the outcome was. Then 4.3 is the difference between that 7.3 and 3.0 is where we'd like to be at. That is that 40% reduction. That looks similar to a bloom in 2012. And so what I want to know is, where did 4.3 come from? Why do we not have a zero bloom if it's all related to nutrient application? Hopefully through this discussion can share a little bit of that, and Laura is going to do a much better job, I think, helping us understand that idea of what happened in the lake. So 10 is a maximum harmful algal bloom. 2.7 was the reduction that we saw this year just based off of conditions of what we would have expected. 4.3 is kind of an unexplained in my mind where it's coming from, and we need to explain better and have a better understanding of that. one thing that I've gone to is working with ODA. They do, for every fertilizer dealer in here, you fill out a report each year on what tonnage you deliver, and with that tonnage report you send in 25 cents per ton in a report to ODA at the end of the year. And what you're doing then is a period of understanding or a period of recording of fertilizer distribution from November 30th or from November 1st through October 31st. The reporting has to be done by the end of November. The data then I got and have started to take a look at it and parsed out, and we're going to look at it much closer here in just a minute. The thing that you want to understand about the fertilizer tonnage data is it's where it's distributed from, not where it's delivered to. So we're going to be able to look at data by a county basis, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that fertilizer was delivered in that county, because we have fertilizer dealers that sit on borders of counties, borders of states. So there is a little bit of nuance in this data that I just want you to understand as we look at it a little bit closer. But from that data, we can get a trend line of what fertilizer delivered in the state of Ohio looks like for that period of November 1st through October 31st. And what we're talking about here is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So I'm not worried about whether it's 1152.0 or if it is 28%. What I'm talking about is the pounds of nitrogen that was delivered, regardless of form. The pounds of phosphorus that was delivered, regardless of form, and the pounds of potassium that was delivered, regardless of form. So what you get from the state data is that we do see this would be the tons of nitrogen that were delivered. This is the tons of potassium delivered, and this is the pounds of phosphorus delivered. As we've talked about phosphorus use in the state of Ohio, what do you see in relationship to that trend line? Basically, we're flat as far as phosphorus use in the state of Ohio. We do see an increasing number for potassium. We see an increasing number for nitrogen. I think some of that makes sense because we see increasing yields, and so some of those numbers should be going up in relationship to use. We can also, because the data is collected and recorded by county, we can start talking about county level data and try and make a relationship there. And when we talk about how we divide up the state from ag statistics standpoint is in crop reporting districts. There's actually 9 of them. 10 through 90 is the way it's designated. I'm going to focus in on 10, and I'm going to focus in on crop reporting district 10 because it is these sets of counties. That border is the basically western Lake Erie Basin area, so the data that we're seeing in the tonnage reports represents what would be fertilizer that's primarily being delivered into and used in that crop reporting district 10. All those green dots there, that would be locations where fertilizer is delivered from. So you can get some perspective on the different outlets from a fertilizer delivery standpoint, where they're located at, and that's why I'm saying that the way the data is recorded, it's not from this outlet could have fertilizer that's going into Wood County, it could be going into Sandusky County. So just keep that in mind, that it's not truly representative of just what goes into that county. Now I'm going to skip to this, and this is that crop reporting district nutrient data. This is what has been happening since 2006 and includes 2019. What you have is nitrogen at the top, phosphorus in the middle, and this time potassium is on the bottom. What do you see with the use of phosphorus in the center chart in that crop reporting district trend line? Going down and going down at a quicker rate than what we see with that state data. So, some of the things that we've been doing to, think about utilizing phosphorus better, I think we're doing that and accomplishing it and seeing it in reductions in tons of usage of phosphorus. kind of interesting that nitrogen is going down in relationship to tons delivered, and potassium down a little bit, which probably was the most surprising to me. But really all three nutrients were showing a trend down. But take a look at that last point on the chart. What happened there? Wet weather allowed not a whole lot of fertilizer to be applied in the fall, and in the fall and through spring, really, of 2019. And basically, we see the amount drop off dramatically for 2019 from that trend line. I want to back up to this. We did a little survey earlier in the year trying to quantify, because we knew that this was happening. We knew that fertilizer dealers weren't delivering nutrient, and I thought it important maybe to have a time point where we knew what had been applied. So we did survey the fertilizer dealers in the Western Lake Erie Basin, worked with Ohio Ag Business Association to get that done, and what they reported to us was tons of P2O5 that were sold in the basically Western Lake Erie Basin was our target, was 8,684 tons, and it was 54% less. Yep.
Go back one second, please. Yeah, right there. So how is that measured? Is that measured by quantitative amounts of water, or is that just a nutrient density? So if you've got more water, you're going to artificially show a lesser value.
This is putting it on pounds of phosphorus contained within that product. Well, we're not talking about runoff. We're talking about fertilizer and tons of fertilizer used in the Western Lake Erie Basin. Yeah, this is actually used. This is not losses that we're talking about. We're talking about 1152 MAP DAP and application is what we're talking about at this point. And what we're talking about here is that fertilizer sales, and this would have been measuring from November through the end of May. What fertilizer dealers reported to me as far as reductions in the normal fertilizer sales that they would have had, and around 54% reduction. Manure is also something that gets targeted and discussed a lot, and what we did was went to 10 of the commercial applicators and talked about their application of what they would have normally done from March through May of 2019, and basically if you do the math, they ended up applying 85% less manure in that basin. They weren't necessarily not busy because they were hauling manure from one storage facility to the next, but they weren't able to get that out as far as land application is concerned. So, you know, a little bit of understanding here from this slide is we applied a lot less nutrient. We're able to quantify that in the end here with reductions of sales for the year and not just that portion of the calendar year. And we end up with something that looks like this for, hitting the buttons wrong. But we end up something like this, that actually what we ended up with in 2019 was this tonnage of nitrogen delivered, which was 46% less, and we ended up with this tonnage for the 2019 year of 44% less. So what the fertilizer kind of did this to basically verify the fertilizer dealers, were they telling me the truth or not, and I think they were. I mean, they came up with 54% that they were reducing their applications earlier in the year, and the total year amount was 44% less, or only 44% of the average. So very much representative, and also look at this number. It was 13,000 tons that were applied versus 9,000 by the end of May. So reality is any fertilizer that got applied was really applied for the most part in that period up to the end of May. So we have a little bit of perspective on when that fertilizer went down. I haven't looked at the data, and I'm sure Laura hasn't either, but the nitrate data would look really interesting in what happens last summer and even in through next year as far as nitrate levels from a water quality perspective. This chart here, I think is, for me, it's just trying to put some perspective on the relationship of nutrient application. This is basically the data that we were looking at just a few minutes ago on that chart with nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium on it. And it's overlaid now with the harmful algal bloom index. And these are the years 2005 to 2019, and we can see those years that we've already talked about. Here's 2011, that was a 10. We look at the bar here, it's the 10.5 of 2015, and we ended up here in 2019 in relationship to a 7.3, basically harmful algal bloom. As you look at the fertilizer sales go up and down, is there any relationship to the amount of harmful algal bloom that we see? Does that surprise you? It shouldn't, because we talked about, here really it's water that moves nutrient, and so, differences in water is going to really make a difference in any given year what we see from a harmful algal bloom perspective. And so the ideal here is just to, is our annual ag practices, do they impact directly what we do? And fertilizer or nutrient application, I guess to me, there's not a direct relationship. It's what happens after that nutrient application with water. And here is those years, and looking at the tonnage that was actually sold in those years. And really 2011, well, let's go to 2015 as kind of the base year. That's where we had that highest bloom, harmful algal bloom, 10.5. What we had was basically 30,000 tons sold. That was the average. If we look at the average from 2006 to 2019, then we had a harmful algal bloom of 10.5. I tried to bring water into the discussion here, or rainfall and events in relationship to runoff. And we have, different years here, 2011, 2015, those very high harmful algal blooms, and the March to July rainfall in those years, at least at Northwest Branch OARDC, was 23 inches in those 2 years. We look at 2016, which again was a lesser bloom, 3.2. Actually, where we'd like to see it every year is something around 3.2. And our March to July rainfall at that point was at OARDC, and when I say point within the watershed, was 14 inches. So we can see how 10 inches of rainfall makes a huge difference in that time period in relationship to the harmful algal bloom and what we see. Then we have 2018 and 19, and I put those 2 years together because reality is the fall of 2018, it was difficult to just get crops harvested, let alone make applications of nutrients. And we see a portion of the reduction in fertilizer sales or delivery in that basin area occurring in that number of 2018 and 2019 put together. Here we actually ended up with a rainfall of 26 inches for that period at OARDC, and we ended up with this 7.3. So here's where I bring that number of 10 and 7.3. Why did we not end up with a 10? I mean, basically based off of rainfall, it should have been at that kind of level. And Laura's going to follow up with a good discussion of that here in just a few minutes. The other thing that has come out recently is we do have a database of soil test results that Libby Dayton and others have collected over time. This is a set of 4 charts, and we won't spend too much time here, but here's the state of Ohio, and this would be the, with the orange, I'm going to call that orange, type of county designation. That's where the soil test trend is decreasing, soil test phosphorus decreasing. You pick that up pretty quick, that's a majority of the counties that soil test trends are decreasing. The couple of red counties, those are where soil test phosphorus levels are increasing, and it's been a significant increase. And then the black or the light pink is where we don't have sufficient or not significant difference either way. And then the black is where there's no data or not enough data to make a determination. This is that crop reporting district 10 and the soil test levels, and really only worry about this bottom line, kind of the average. And I need to explain something first here. This is statistics, sticks in my mind not very well, so I had to go look it up and put a description to this. And basically what we're talking about is percentiles, and 25, 50, 75, and 90. So what the heck does that mean? Basically, what we're talking about is with a 25% percentile is the point where 25% of the data is less than that. With the 50% tile, that's basically the middle of the data set, and there's 50% below, 50% above. So when we talk about 50%, what does that mean? It is the mean, right? It's the average. And then the 75% would be everything that accounting for everything that's below that, 75% of what's below that, and then 90% of the data points are below that. So you can really parse this out in that kind of way, but to me the important numbers are right here, that when we talk about soil test level, that the mean in the region of the state that we're talking about with crop reporting district 10 is 36 part per million Mehlich 3. So that's the average soil test. 90% of the soil tests are less than 84 parts per million Mehlich 3 value. So when we start to talk about some of these environmental sensitivity ratings and so forth, gives us some perspective that a large majority of our soil samples are, in that range that would be 2 times our, tri-state fertilizer recommendation of 40 parts per million in the upper end. The green county, or the green numbers here, are all the decreasing values, significant decrease. The red numbers here is where we see an increase and significant increase being shown in those, and really the 2 counties are Allen and Van Wert that we need to, have shown an increase as far as soil test levels. Not sure what that's related to, but these are just the numbers that we're seeing in that. You might be interested, so those values that are increasing, all the numbers in green, what's the average percent reduction that has happened, and this is a period 1998 to 2015. That might be an important factor to know. We're not talking about 1% reduction. Actually, on average, it's around a 20% reduction that has happened in the soil test level comparing 2015 to the previous years. So 2 good things, right? Fertilizer sales or nutrient use of phosphorus is going down. Soil test levels are going down. And the reason that soil test levels are going down is because we can start to use some of this fertilizer data to measure the pounds applied of phosphorus. In other words, what we are adding from a phosphorus fertilizer application standpoint. And then with the orange line, we're measuring the annual per acre removal with the crops that we're pulling off. Is there a reason that soil test levels should be going down? We are applying, it appears to me, at a rate that's less than what crop removal is. So that should be, from a water quality perspective, what? Hopefully it's a good thing. I mean, that should be what we're being told that we need to do, and we've already been doing it for a number of years in relationship to crop removal. This is using the fertilizer data here. NRCS has recently done their SEEP study, so if you're kind of wondering, so how much would manure add to this? Are we making up all the difference with manure? Over the entire basin, Western Lake Erie Basin, basically manure accounts for about 2 pounds added phosphorus if you took the manure and applied it equally over all acres. So it doesn't make up for the difference that you're seeing here in crop removal. So we are actually seeing additions of phosphorus being less than what crop removal is, and seeing soil test levels respond. This is the data for prevented plant acres, and you can see that for that crop reporting district 10, those key 10, 11 counties, basically we have 2 million acres of cropland. This would be corn, soybean, and wheat. This is the prevented plant acres, and actually we've had prevented plant before. 2015, it was really kind of restricted to Defiance County and kind of a northwest Ohio, just a couple county area where we had 90,000 acres. But here in 2019, those 10, 11 counties had 700,000 acres, basically about a third of the acres that were not planted in that year, past year. What does that mean for water quality? Kevin's put together some data. Basically, Kevin King, with some of the sites in Northwest Ohio, we had, the experience of this past year of not having some of our acres planted for the edge of field sites. And so we do get a good perspective on what the impact is of that ideal of not having any fertilizer, any practice being conducted on that over a growing season, and how did that affect phosphorus and several other factors. The chart that I want you to focus in on is DRP. What you see here are 14 sites that were not in, and these would be 14 of the fields that were not planted this past year to any production crop. They may have been in a cover crop, in weeds, and a few things like that this past growing season. The dark line is what you see is the average for the period up to 2019 from those sites, and then what would be the open bar is the water year 2019 measurement. Basically, what are you seeing here? We're seeing more phosphorus coming off of preventive plant fields is what we're seeing here compared to the average. Now, remember I threw up some charts where we had 23 inches and 15 inches of rainfall, and Kevin's so far just analyzed this looking at the average. We probably need to go back and look at similar years, right, and compare it to where the water over the summer months was similar, not an average of the overall year. And Kevin's working diligently on that, I'm sure. But I think that's going to be the true comparison. Did preventive plant actually result in increased losses? Because that's important to our understanding of what Laura's going to present in just a minute or two. Some other things that are data that we need to consider is what's happening from a tillage standpoint. We do have some data now that has been put together by it's CTIC out of Indiana. They've been working with TNC and looking at a satellite imagery type of analysis to come up with what tillage practices are going on in a region of the state. And this would be the trends here, and we see no-till going up and down. We see then reduced tillage following a similar path and as far as going the opposite direction of no-till. And then we see here the reduced tillage and conventional tillage, which tend to be pretty level. I mean, people that are in that type of system are in that and using it year after year. Don't have any strong opinion to throw at this, but it's been a missing component that we haven't been necessarily able to talk about very directly, and now we have a data set that I think is a little more sound that we can use to maybe go back and look at some of these past years. The final piece of data that I just want to share with you, because I think it's an important part of the discussion, is that in 2007 and 2012, all of you were asked on your Ag Census form, or anybody that filled out the Ag Census form, is tell us what the percentage of tile in your farm, or what percentage of your cropland acres are in with tile. And this is a representation of that for that area, and of Crop Reporting District 10 and results there. The gray line is the 2012 data. 2017 is the orange line, and all of them are going up, right? From 2012 to 2017. I don't think that would be a surprise to anybody in this room. But we do see where Henry County is basically 90% tiled at this point. We have Banwork County and Wood County at pretty high levels as well, which not surprising considering the soil types that they have there. But that's another piece of the data that we haven't had a lot of confidence in what's been used in some of the things that we've been doing. And finding this data set, and then there's a couple of other data sets which can take this a little further back in time, because the million-dollar question, the however much value you want to put on it, the question that we've never answered is, where is this DRP coming from? Why are we seeing DRP at an increased level in water flowing down the Maumee River, because reality is I don't think any of their data shows that we've changed practices a great deal to explain that. So is there something else that is going on that we need to understand? So just wanted to kind of expose you and maybe get you thinking a little bit about some of the data that we have available, and more think about it in your neighborhood as far as what's happening with you and your neighbors and how practices have been working. Do these numbers make sense? I think we're doing the right thing from a nutrient management standpoint, and talking about placement and rate. Those are very important. And I think the good thing that we can maybe start talking about from something like this is that we do see a downward trend in phosphorus use. So farmers are not overusing phosphorus nutrient. We're seeing that result in a reduction in soil test levels up in that region. I think that's a positive thing with outcomes that we're looking at. We have some other studies that we can go back and rely on to kind of triangulate some of this data off of. There's a SEEP study. I didn't mention it earlier, but IPNI, the NUGIS, it's basically nutrient GIS system, also does some similar calculations as far as inputs and outputs. And now this data that we're putting together from ODA. My big question is, how do we, if we go about making changes that only address a small portion of the phosphorus inputs into the lake, are we ever going to get to 3.0? And there's a community that's not going to be happy until we get to 3.0. In fact, I'm not sure they're going to be happy when we get to 3.0, because that means we still have coverage of harmful algal blooms in that basin. But we need to think about that 4.3. It's a fairly large number. How do we reduce that? What is the cause of that? What are things that we need to put in place to reduce that? And maybe it's starting to parse out, is some of that not even reducible? In other words, is it part of the phosphorus going into Lake Erie, which I think we have to believe something that we can't control? It was happening before we started farming. Phosphorus was moving downstream, natural system. But maybe we can get a better perspective on what that amount is from some of this information. Okay, I think I will, let's go one quick question while Laura's walking up and we get change.
On your one slide about a dozen back where I had that harmful algal blooms and the phosphorus salt, I think the data started in 2005. Do you have any, what's the HAB index before 2005?
Yeah, the question is the slide on harmful algal blooms. Really, we start with 2005 for any of that index of harmful algal blooms. 2002. I was showing 2005 because it matched the data set, but it goes back to 2002 as the first measure.
2002, somewhere through 2002
was fairly low up to that.
2003 was a little bit higher because that was when the first bloom happened. But anyway, hi everyone. I'm Laura. I've been coming to these conferences for a while now, so you're probably going to see some familiar slides, which I expect you all to have memorized by now. So if you don't, then there'll be homework later. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about 2019. But what I want to start with is just some general overview, what we're doing, and then some of the background data, and then what we saw. So I'm hoping that anything that's confusing, because it seems like it's a bit confusing, is a little bit, tiny bit clearer after I talk about it a bit more. So just as a quick reminder, we sample the Maumee River in Waterville. You can see that map here. But the Maumee River, and that's what I'm going to focus on today, but the Maumee River is really only one of 23 stations that we're monitoring. You can see we monitor all around Ohio, up into Michigan. We have a lot of focus around Lake Erie for good reason, but it's also near where we're located, so we have a little bit more attention there anyway. The Maumee River and the Sandusky are our longest term stations. We've been monitoring there since 1974. Our newest stations that we've added have been these small, tiny watersheds all throughout the Western Basin. And the idea with those is that we want to be able to start to adaptively manage a little bit better, right? See how these practices, see if we can get more practices in those watersheds to see if they're actually doing what we think they should be doing. So a lot of those are going into place so we can set that system up. If you went to any one of these red dots, what you would see is basically a shed on some stilts beside a river. Looks something like this, right? I'm sure you've seen them all over the place. Inside of the river, there's a pump. This pump makes it look like it's huge. It's really just like this big. That's essentially pumping water continually into the building, into a sink, basically, and it flows right through so that we can sample that water with an automated sampler. That's pulling samples 3 times a day and storing it in a refrigerator that we then go and collect these samples and bring them back to the lab for analysis. So literally, I'm talking about people driving around all over the place, picking up samples. The ones that are kind of far away, they ship to us. And then we analyze them for all kinds of things. I only ever really talk about phosphorus. What I do, nope, I don't even think I show one nitrogen talk slide. I had one, but I cut it. So I'm sorry, it's all phosphorus today. But we measure various forms of phosphorus and nitrogen, other things like chloride, suspended sediments, how muddy the water is, and then we do pesticides at some stations. And so as you can imagine, this generates these really huge continuous databases. This is essentially one river with one of the things that we measure over this period of time. So that's a lot of data. This is kind of hard to explain, so I try to turn it into other things that make a little bit more sense. And so before I do that, I'm going to go through some of the various things that I talk about because that's where the confusion comes in. So I'm going to talk a lot about loading. You've heard a lot about loading. That's basically just the mass of whatever nutrient. So metric tons of phosphorus over some amount of time. My example here is per year that is leaving that river where we monitor it, right? That's a load. Loading is basically the concentration of that nutrient. So how much milligrams of phosphorus there is per liter times the volume of water that it's in. How many liters of water are there? And that's how you get back to this, right? So you have to have the two of those. So load is basically what is the volume of that concentration of water. And the way you can conceptualize it is through coffee. This is my favorite example so far. So if we have a cup of coffee, and this is like a little cup. So this is like you go to the diner and you have to drink like 15 of them before you even start to feel the caffeine, right? So it's a little cup of coffee, and you put a whole packet of sugar in there, maybe multiple packets. Then you're going to have a concentration of sugar in there that you can taste. It's fairly well concentrated amount of sugar per volume of coffee. It's sweet. But if you were like really tired, you're making your coffee, and instead of putting a sugar into your cup, you accidentally put it into the entire pot, that wouldn't be very much concentration at all. You probably wouldn't even taste any sugar, right? It would be like not at all sweet. Very low concentration. But you can imagine if you guys drink this one pot, and you can tell by how quickly I speak that I probably drank the entire pot, we would have both consumed 1 packet of sugar. We would have had the same load. So what does that mean? What do I mean by all this? Well, we can look at things like this. This is showing all of the inputs going into Lake Erie. This is in terms of phosphorus load from all these different rivers. And you see the size of the arrow is relative to how much loading is going into the river. So you see 2 big arrows. We have the Detroit River and the Maumee River. Now, they have very similar loads, a little over 2,000 metric tons. But the Detroit River is the pot of coffee, and the Maumee River is the cup of coffee. 95% of the water going into the Western Basin is coming from the Detroit River because it's actually bringing water from the upper Great Lakes, from Lake Huron. So if it has the same load as the Maumee, that means the concentration in here is really low compared to what's coming out of the Maumee River, right? Ironically, you can't tell that actually the Portage River and the Sandusky River have very similar concentrations to the Maumee, but they're so small that that arrow is tiny. They're like thimbles of coffee, right? Maybe droplets of coffee, relatively speaking. Okay, so keeping that in mind, I'm going to be speaking a lot about concentration and load. I'm going to, hopefully go back to this reference so we'll remember that. Okay, so what we've learned over time, we see all these comparisons on these big annual scales. What I just showed you was a long-term annual average of Maumee, but what we've learned is exactly what Greg was describing before, is that it's not all year that matters. It's a certain period of time. And the 2011-2012 is the best example of that, right? 2011, we had that really big bloom, went to a very small bloom, really wet spring, really dry spring. But when we look over the whole year for the Maumee River, between these two, we get basically the same phosphorus load, you can see that in orange, and the same discharge, you can see it in blue, over the whole year. And that's because the difference between these 2 years is that The loading in 2011 happened in May. The loading in 2012 happened in the fall. And so when we had this year, we're like, well, clearly this isn't explaining what's going on, right? What's explaining what's going on is a very shortened period of time. And over time, we've come to rely on this March through July time period. And in doing that, now you see we go from really high to really low. Greg also pointed out very aptly is that we then went for a few years doing this forecast, and we had 2015 to 2016, which if you're really following along, before then we didn't include July, but then in 2015, goodness me, July was crazy. So then we added it in, and we got that same, was really high to really low. But this isn't really how you science. This is how you show some interesting trends. So if we turn this into something more interesting, we can put all of the bloom index here. So this is how big the bloom is, and all of those loads here. And you can see that water volume, particulate phosphorus, dissolved phosphorus, and this is total bioavailable phosphorus. They all do a really good job of describing bloom size. We use right now total bioavailable phosphorus as our metric for what we base the forecast off of, because it takes a bit of the DRP, all of the bits that are bioavailable. It takes all the DRP, so that's, all of that is available for algae to use. They can grow explosively from dissolved phosphorus. It only takes a small portion of the particulate phosphorus because only some of the particulates are available, and then a good chunk of them actually settle out between Waterville and the lake. So it ends up being about 8% of the particulate phosphorus. So this is what our bloom forecast is based off of. But as you can see, and I'm going to come back to this idea that these are all, kind of similarly related to bloom size. So what do we find in 2019? Well, 2019, we had a really wet spring. We just went over that a lot, right? 26 inches of precipitation. It was a lot of rain. And you can see that here. So I just showed you all of these figures. You can see that this is our third highest flow. I only show this through 2011, but that goes all the way back to 1975 when we began monitoring on the Maumee. Dissolved phosphorus load was also high, but not as high. It was the 5th highest since 2002, and it was the 9th highest going all the way back to 1975. So still very high, just not quite as high as flow. So based off of this, this is basically pictures of the 2019 bloom. You can see it wasn't a small bloom. It still covered most of the western basin. It went from Ohio all the way over to Canada, right? But it was the most intense here, right in Maumee Bay. This is around Maumee Bay State Park. If you went to Maumee Bay State Park on August when I have this here, it looked like this, right? So I can't give a talk without showing some big green picture, right? So you can have some perspective of what we're talking about here. So you can see this is Maumee Bay State Park. Here's the beach, and the water at the beach is pretty green. The samples that were collected were pretty green, and it was a fairly expansive bloom in this region for sure. And so it was big. We say it's not as big as it was. When I talk to other folks, they're like, what are you talking about? Did you see what the beach looked like? I'm like, I know, I hear you, but it could have been worse, I swear. Okay, so that's where we were. So what we had forecast was a 7.3. You can see our forecast here in red. This is what we observed, or sorry, 7.5. What we observed was a 7.3. And we based that off of total bioavailable phosphorus. That went pretty well. But if we had used any of those other models, aside from dissolved phosphorus, if you use the particulate phosphorus model or use the flow model for this year, we would have expected something like 2011, which would have been way higher, right? And actually, you can tell one of the models that's used in the forecast is using a total phosphorus model. And you can see it's that one right there, right? That high one up here that gave us all this range, which is what bumped it up and made it so that we're not quite down and matching perfect. So this is what I want to focus on a bit more right now. Okay, so why did we had a high load, not as high as it should have been. Like, what do I really mean by this, and how did we figure this out? That's the real question, right? And so this is another way of showing how interrelated these loads are to flow. Right? So this is showing flow, which is in black. For some reason, our acronym for that is Q. So anytime you see Q, that means discharge or water volume or flow, whatever you want to call it. We've got particulate phosphorus is in orange and dissolved phosphorus is in purple because, you know, purple's my favorite color, so I got to throw it in there every once in a while. And you can see they track each other since 2002 really well. Well, I always go back to 2002 because that's the period of time in which we have satellite imagery. That's how long we've been able to have a bloom severity index number and be able to quantify bloom size. And you can see, like, goodness, how do you track a trend with this? Like, this is kind of, it's ridiculous a little bit, right? You can kind of see the trend I'm going to go with. It's just like, look, 2019 was not up here, right? But if you were just looking at this data, it would be really kind of hard to figure that out. So the real way that you do this is you take these two and you relate them to each other, right? So now we're showing dissolved phosphorus load. Remember, these are the sugar packets, right? And then discharge ranging from a cup of coffee to a pot of coffee, right? But for the Maumee River. And what you see is that from 2000 to 2018, these black dots, they're really closely related. That's not a surprise. I just showed you like 5 figures saying the same thing. Look, flow goes up and loads go up, and flow goes down and loads go down, right? We know this is a thing. But because they're so well related, this is a really handy way to see, are we seeing changes? Are we seeing trends in a direction or not? Right? And then what we can look at is, are we off the line? So here's 2019. And you can see for 2019, we had, remember, high flow, but we are way lower than where we should have been, right? We should have been up here on this line. We're not. So when we say if loads were 30% lower, this is exactly what we mean. This is where it was, should have been, this is where it was. So that's kind of cool. The other neat things that can include on this figure are our targets, right? You always hear these buzzwords about targets, a 40% decrease based off of a year and blah, blah, blah. Well, basically, what it amounts to are 2 targets. We have one that's a straight line. This would be what we would have to be 2012. We have one that's a moving line, which is basically saying, once you get really high flows, this is our target. So you can see where we wanted to be was here. Didn't quite get there, but we got awfully close this year, even compared to past years when flow is quite high. All right, let's look at particulate phosphorus, because who doesn't want to look at particulate phosphorus, right? Okay, so here's particulate phosphorus, and you can see also really good fit between that load and the flow, right? Also, not a surprise. I just showed you 5 other figures that said basically the same thing. Okay, 2019 was right on that line. I told you this because I said, well, the forecast, if we use particulate phosphorus or flow, would have put us way up high because that's pretty high. But those of you who are savvy back there, you're probably noticing this weird point right here, which happens to be 2015. So in 2015, we had a similar but opposite occurrence. We had lower particulate phosphorus loading than we would have expected based off of flow. Should have been up there, right? Whereas DRP 2015 was the very highest load that we've had, right? Really high. And if we haven't already pointed it out, 2015 was a really big bloom year. And so the other thing that this year has shown us is how important variations in dissolved phosphorus are in regulating that bloom size, right? Now, what does this tell us? Well, I just said that, so I'm not going to say it over again. But if we deal with dissolved phosphorus export, that's probably going to have the biggest influence on bloom size specifically. Being really specific here because we don't really know good controls on toxicity. We know if there wasn't anything there, they wouldn't be toxic. That's about as far as we can go. We think it's loosely connected to nitrogen. Not talking about the dead zone in the central basin, like that low oxygen that can influence fish habitat. That's probably affected by year-round loading, including particulates. But I'm talking specifically about the size of the bloom. Okay. The other thing is that fertilizer that's been applied over that previous year, because Greg just went into all this detail about how that was affected this year, seems to have a pretty big influence over spring and summer loads, right? And I say over the past year because we know that the fall applications were affected as well as spring applications. So we think that that whole thing, we can't separate them out at this point at least. Okay, but this is kind of intriguing for a number of reasons. And the first one is that when we think of dissolved phosphorus loss from the edge of field, we usually think, oh, well, you have higher dissolved phosphorus loss when you have high soil tests, right? You can see that increase here. However, this past year, even with our lack of phosphorus application, we wouldn't actually expect a huge change in soil tests because typically how we manage phosphorus on the field is we want to maintain a bank of crop available phosphorus such that if something happens, you can't apply for some reason, you're not going to have a yield hit, right? That's the whole strategy. That's why we have a maintenance range, so you can have some flexibility there, right? On top of that, there's some cool data that's coming out of the soil fertility labs that shows, you know, if you don't apply phosphorus, these are red ones here, it can take many years before you start to really see big decreases in soil test levels, right? Some of these, of course, Clark County is the caveat here, but even just from one year to the next, there's a change, but it's not so much that you would expect a huge difference in those exports. And so what that really points to me, is that it's how we're applying phosphorus that's also playing a big role. And I think that there's going to be a talk later that's going to be talking about separating out this legacy component, if you want to call that anything that was applied before that water year, and the actual application, that freshly applied phosphorus, right? And so what it points to when we think of the 4 R's, and we think of that a lot because it is all over the place, you can't miss it, right? How do we apply phosphorus? And it points to things like the right timing and right placement. You know, we hear about that a lot. And I can't help but wonder if, you know, timing, if we're applying phosphorus on saturated ground in the spring, if that's a problem, you know? We know that there's rules against all of this right now. And so I almost grayed it out, but I'm going to leave it there because that's part of what it points to. The other thing that we hear a lot more about is trying to avoid surface placement of fertilizers and getting it, you know, subsurface placement. But as Greg so aptly pointed out, we're talking about a maximum, and we think other things are probably at play here, getting to our 30% lower than expected loads, right? That means there's 70% that's in this other area, which would be thinking of things like right rate. What are you maintaining your soils at? You know, where is your soil located in the soil column? Those types of things. Are you accounting for all the phosphorus that you're using? Those types of issues. So part of it is stuff that's not from this year, and that's part of the big question, right? But 30% is a big number when we want to have a 40% reduction in a super, super wet year. And so it's not something we can ignore. But what we do know is that there's a lot of people doing a lot of stuff, a lot of work on the field, in the soils, at the edge of field, that we can pull all this information together so that hopefully next year or the year after when we come, we'll say, oh, well, this is how we got here, and this is what we can do to replicate that, knowing that we don't think it, what I'm going to say is I don't think the answer is don't apply. I think it's going to be more nuanced than that. So with that, I have to thank all of the people that help support our tributary monitoring program. You can probably find your favorite and least favorite logos on here. But really, it's the Andersons in the state of Ohio who are supporting our Maumee River Station. And if you want to get in touch with me outside of here, here's all my contact info. And I'm guessing we have time for questions, because I usually talk fast. Any questions? Over here.
Heidelberg does the presentation. What do you see happening at Heidelberg for the next 10 years? There's
Yeah.
lots of studies and what's on the horizon for Europe?
Yeah. So the question was, what's on the horizon at Heidelberg specifically? Well, you got a taste of it because a lot of what we've been adding are smaller watersheds. And so what we want to hopefully do is kind of replicate like what Kevin King's doing, right? And be like, okay, so we're doing this edge of field comparison of different practices. How do we scale that up to a watershed? The other thing that I'm hopefully getting into a little bit more is some of the other sensors, getting our data online and more real time and more usable and more accessible so people can see that a little bit easier than it is now. I try and visit all kinds of places, of course, but you know, I think there's ways that we can continue to do that. You know, increased improvements in modeling and those sorts of things as well. So, you know, right now we've got, with this many stations, we certainly have a lot on our plate, and I don't think that support for water monitoring is going anywhere in the near future. The good thing is that, you know, there's an awful lot of efforts. You know, we can't miss H2 Ohio right now, right? So an awful lot of efforts that are going on, and so I'm excited to see how all of that overplays into some of the trends that we're seeing as well. So that's just a little bit of it. We're looking at in-stream processing with some collaborators, try and handle that. Is there phosphorus coming from ditches and banks and that sort of thing, and how do we quantify that to better backtrack our numbers. Yeah, all kinds of stuff, yeah.
I have a question.
Okay, Greg.
Could you back up to the slide that you had with the different flows of phosphorus, the line chart? Yeah, one.
It's almost there. I got all the animations. Okay.
So, just a quick question. I mean, when
Yeah.
you look at 2011 and you look at the difference in total phosphorus and DRP,
Yeah.
you have something that's not quite as dramatic as 2019. Is there any relationships there that we ought to be looking at?
Well, I think that possibly, but the forecast that would be based off of either just discharge or particulate phosphorus for bloom size actually would have predicted a bigger bloom in that year than what we got. And in some cases, like when you look at sort of how they're related, that's one of the lines that sort of falls off a little bit. Clearly not as much as 2019, but it's not, because the timing of the rain played a big role in this, right? So the rain in 2011 was early enough that we tend to get higher particulate and erosion a little bit earlier in the spring. Once planting has occurred, and we get into like June and July, then we start to see a shift. We don't get quite as much of that runoff. And so you can see that here where the particulate phosphorus load was even higher relative to flow because it was that erosional period, where in 2015, it was the opposite. In the 2015, because we had those June and July, we just didn't have as much erosion, but we still had a similar amount of dissolved phosphorus. But I do wonder, now that we have access at least to these sales data, if 2011 fertilizer sales were different, then that could play a role. But I can't remember off the top of my head if that was the case or not.
They were down, but not as much as...
Yeah, because it was May time, that could have affected some applications, but yeah. A question here.
You have lots of correlations to the amount of water that fell out of the sky. What about the relation to temperature of the water and amount of sunshine?
Yeah, so the temperature of the water plays some effect, not as much as you think, because the temperature of the Western Basin doesn't vary from year to year as much as it would seem. This is the way we think it plays a role, though. So you can't tell, but, well, I'm not going to be able to show it, but in 2003, we actually had a pretty high July load, but we had a fairly not so extreme bloom. And the reason we think that happened is temperature related. It was a really cold spring. It stayed cold, and like you could even see it in what was growing in the lake, right? That it stayed cold all the way through all of June, and it pushed back the way that bloom was forming at that time. And so we think that temperature played a role there, which is why we didn't include July for a really long time. Then we had 2015, temperatures were normal. Things heated up just as predicted in June, and then we got that June and July, loading that then led to a bigger bloom. The other flip side is 2008. 2008, we actually over-predicted the bloom a little bit. If you remember, in 2008, things heated up fast. It was really warm in June. I'm sure you guys all remember all of these little synchronicities of these blooms, but nonetheless, it got really, really warm early in June, and actually we had the blooms start to form in June while there's other things blooming at the same time, like our good algae that normally blooms then, that we think caused potentially some competition with the harmful bloom, that made it so that that on top of late season storms where it cooled off at the end of the season, which usually just basically destroys any bloom formation, those two things we think helped basically make that bloom not quite as big as what we may have expected. So it plays a role, certainly, because if it's not over 70, we're not going to have any bloom formation, but it doesn't usually vary from one year to the next as much as we would think. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
That's half of it.
Okay.
The other half is additional sunlight, therefore additional photosynthesis.
Well, sunlight, basically, we only get blooms in the summertime because of temperature and day length. And part of the reason you see the blooms sort of start to run out towards the end of the season has to do with day length as well. So it's temperature, day length, and usually something with, they use up all the nitrogen oftentimes that ends the bloom pretty quickly. So, yeah.
The reason we don't have a bloom on Maumee River, major source, because of the clarity of the water.
part, and it's flowing. These things don't like flowing water usually, but there have been times where the river acts more like a lake. Things sort of stop and settle, and then we do see that. But oftentimes, if it's not a weird occurrence like that, the nutrients usually flow downstream, and then we don't see there be as much support for a bloom at that time.
Long Bay River and Grand Rapids, we have a dam back to like,
Yeah.
I think that we should be seeing a bloom there sometime, but we never see any, so things like that.
Yeah, well, turbidity certainly does play some role, but usually what that'll end up doing is selecting for something that's not microcystis. So microcystis, which grows in the western basin, likes clear water. It creates those scums, right? And they think that zebra mussels played a role in that water clarity and selecting for microcystis. But in Sandusky Bay and Grand Lake, and usually in the rivers, you tend to see planktothrix, because planktothrix doesn't like as high light conditions. They like to be down in the water column a little bit, and so they tend to do a little bit better when it's turbid. But I think that it has to be a certain sweet spot of conditions in rivers for that to happen, because they don't have sort of the seed bank of things growing there in the same way that the lake does. And it has to have, like I said, it has to be the right timing in which you have stormwater coming in that has all that concentration and then stopping to be able to help form that bloom. We saw that in like the Ohio River. What was it? I want to say maybe it was in 2015, because in 2015 we had those late season storms, but then basically it dried up. It basically turned into a drought. All that water stopped, and it was there to be able to help seed some of those big blooms. And so rivers are a little weirder because they're moving. It makes it harder for those types of floating organisms. Here.
10 years ago or more, the state of Ohio attempted to adopt nutrient water quality standards for nitrogen and phosphorus, that we could take measurements from streams and say those nutrients are high or low.
Yeah.
One question, if the state were to continue to pursue that, would that be helpful in sorting out what's going on here? In other words, if the state has nutrient water quality standards for nitrogen and phosphorus in streams, would that be helpful to your research?
Yes and no, perhaps. I think the problem is that when the timing in which we have high concentration is always during high flow. And there's not very many people that like to go and collect samples then. So, if we're going out and we're looking at like the low flow background conditions, probably more cases than not, all you would end up being able to do is detect that there's a point source or there's not a point source that's nearby, unless people are going out and collecting these high concentration samples. Doesn't mean it can't be done. One of my dreams moving forward is actually to help develop or support some citizen science where we could do a little bit more collaborated storm sampling type of ideas, where we're not just going and getting low flow, but like getting something across that range of a hydrograph so we can better understand if there's variation across the watershed. Because honestly, everywhere I collect a sample, it seems like we get to about the same storm flow concentration, which points me more to this legacy phosphorus issue instead of, well, semi-legacy, right, related to this bank of phosphorus rather than to, this spot being high and that spot being low, right? Doesn't mean they're not useful, because things like that are still useful. But my understanding is what the state has done is moving towards, in the streams, saying, okay, well, what we need to know is what's living there and then how that's being affected by what is coming in. And for a stream, that makes sense, because you could have a scenario where it's a low flow, deep pool area, and it just is going to be poor habitat and nothing can live there. And if you have inputs there, it's going to be more affected by than this like super nice riffly area. So for instance, lots of spots in the Sandusky River would be considered really high quality for more water habitat, because it's like all bedrock and pretty riffles and stuff. It's a really great place to kayak, as a matter of fact, because I go there a lot. But if you looked at the storm concentrations, you probably would have never predicted that. So it's trickier when you get into those rivers.